It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October, and the drizzle outside had grown heavier, soaking the cobblestones along Boulevard Richard Lenoir. From the open window of his office, Chief Inspector Maigret could hear the occasional hiss of tires. Against the wet road and the hollow ring of a tram bell farther down, the radiator behind his desk groaned faintly. The office was warm, but not uncomfortably so, just enough to make a man drowsy after lunch. He sat with his pipe cooling between his fingers, watching the rain form fat rivulets down the window pane. He wasn't working a case. He wasn't even reading a file. He was sitting, as he sometimes did, with his coat hung behind the door and a newspaper folded under his arm, letting the silence speak. Janvier was out interviewing someone in the 11th arrondissement. Lucas had been pulled into an internal meeting about resources. Maigret could have gone home early. Mme Maigret had made veal stew that morning and said she'd warm it for supper. He nodded. He usually did. But something about the quiet had kept him seated. He had noticed it earlier, too, a slight edge to the air, a weight that hadn't quite settled. It wasn't anything he could name, just a feeling. Maybe the way a pigeon had fluttered into the courtyard, then darted off again as if it had mistaken the precinct for something else. Maybe it was the way Lapointe had remarked over coffee that morning about the boy who used to deliver papers to the station, the one who suddenly stopped coming 2 weeks ago. It hadn't meant anything at the time. A boy loses interest in a delivery route. Perhaps he found a better one. Perhaps he didn't. He lit his pipe again, tamping it down with his thumb, the tobacco warm and faintly bitter on his tongue. The door opened gently, not urgently, and Sergeant Lucas stepped in, shaking an umbrella that was clearly more decorative than effective. His coat was speckled with rain across the shoulders. "There's something odd," Lucas said without preamble. "Not serious. Maybe not even ours, but odd." Maigret didn't answer right away. He nodded for Lucas to sit. Lucas sat. That was. The rhythm between them, no rushing, no forced significance. A moment passed. "There's a small hotel near Gare de l'Est," Lucas continued. "The Hotel La Marignan. Nothing special. 12 rooms, 2 floors, a dining room that serves burnt toast in the morning. The concierge there, Madame Belleau, came in earlier. She didn't ask to speak to anyone, just stood in the lobby until one of the boys noticed her, said she wasn't sure who to talk to." Maigret waited. Lucas leaned back slightly. "She said one of her bellboys has disappeared. A young man named Noel, about 18, came down from Alsace in spring. Decent boy, quiet. Hasn't shown up since Saturday night. No message, no suitcase taken, just gone. 3 days," Maigret murmured. "They don't usually come to us for 3 days." "She wouldn't have," Lucas said. "But she says she went to his room Sunday morning, found the bed made, shoes under the chair, his uniform hanging in the armoire, everything there, except him. No one saw him leave." Maigret let the words settle. It wasn't a crime yet, not officially. A boy might run off, a girl, a lie, even just boredom. But they usually took their toothbrush, or said something, left a note, or a mess. Disappearance without disruption. That was the part that always pressed at the back of his mind. Did. She reported at the station in her arrondissement. She did. They told her to wait. Said he'd come back. Lucas made a face. She's the sort who doesn't insist. But she came anyway. To us. Why us? Lucas shrugged, said. We listened better. Maigret gave a soft chuckle, almost to himself. He reached for his overcoat without urgency, lifting it from the hook with a practiced hand. He didn't ask for the address. Lucas would have it. He didn't ask what time they should go. It was now dark as he stood. He looked again toward the window. The rain wasn't stopping, not yet. The streets below glistened, the kind of slick, grimy wetness that made Paris feel older than it was. Somewhere beneath the sound of tires and footsteps, there was the faint tolling of a church bell, thin, weary, and in his chest, just faintly, that quiet nudge again, the one that had kept him from going home early. A bellboy had vanished, and Maigret felt it wasn't just the boy who was missing, but something left behind, to quiet, too orderly. The taxi dropped them just shy of Rue d'Alsace, its tires hissing as it pulled away. Rain still slicked the pavement, though it had eased into a steady mist. Maigret adjusted his hat and lit another pipe, the smoke curling into the cool afternoon. Lucas walked beside him, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing until they reached the small brass plaque beside a narrow, weathered door. Hettel le Marignan. It was the kind of place one passed 100 times, without noticing. 3 windows on the upper floors, lace curtains yellowed from cigarette smoke, and the faint hum of a radio somewhere inside. They stepped into a dim vestibule where the smell of boiled cabbage lingered. A wooden counter framed the front desk, behind which sat an older woman with silver hair in a tight bun, wearing a whereupon vest and wire-rimmed glasses. She was not writing, not filing papers, simply waiting. The kind of stillness only long years of routine could produce. At the sight of Lucas, she stood. You're the one I spoke to. Lucas nodded. And this is Chief Inspector Maigret. Madame Bellew gave a small, nervous smile. I didn't want to make trouble. I know boys come and go, but Noel wasn't. Like the others, he never missed a shift, always cleaned the brass on the front doors himself. Even if no one asked, Maigret nodded slowly, removing his overcoat and folding it over one arm. He said nothing, letting her talk, which she seemed quietly relieved to do. He came to us in April. His uncle arranged it, said the boy wanted to work somewhere decent before joining the army. I gave him room 9, attic floor, but bright, facing the courtyard. He'd been saving, said he was sending money home. Saturday night, he worked as usual, helped the guests with bags, set out coffee things. I went up Sunday morning to change linens. The bed was made, slippers under the chair. His razor was still wet. Maigret moved toward the narrow staircase, his hand brushing the polished banister. No bags gone, none. And no one saw him leave, not even the night porter. And he's blind in one eye but notices everything. Lucas asked about the guests. Anyone unfamiliar? Anyone who came in late? Madame Bellew looked uncomfortable. There was a man in room 4, Monsieur Delcroix, registered Thursday, tall, dark suit, Thin mustache, very polite. He paid in cash, didn't say much, and I didn't ask. He left Monday morning. Maigret took note. Not in a notebook, just in his manner, in the way his brows lowered slightly. Did the boy speak of him? No. But, and now that you ask, I saw Noel outside Saturday evening, smoking a cigarette. He didn't usually. He looked preoccupied. Maigret ascended the stairs without comment, each creak of the wood sharp in the quiet building. Room 9 was on the top floor, tucked beneath the sloping eaves. Madame Bellew followed behind, keys jangling softly as she unlocked the door. The room was sparse, a narrow bed, an iron coat hook, a chipped wash basin, and a small table with a jam tin holding to pencils. The scent of shaving soap still lingered faintly. The uniform hung neatly in the wardrobe. A pair of socks had been folded and placed on the pillow, as if their owner had meant to return within minutes. Maigret sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking. He didn't move for several minutes. He looked at the shoes under the chair, one tilted slightly, toe pointing toward the window. He looked at the cup beside the basin, water dried at the bottom. He opened the window and looked down into the courtyard, where a cat curled beside a drainpipe. He closed it again. No signs of packing. Maigret murmured. He didn't plan to go. Lucas looked around. Could someone have called him downstairs or knocked at the door? Maigret said, someone he knew, someone he didn't fear. They left the room and descended the stairs. At the front desk, Maigret paused. This Monsieur Delcroix. Do you have the registration slip? Madame Bellew hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a dog-eared card. The name was written in tight block letters. No first name, just Delcroix. The address, Rue de Charenton, no number. No ID was taken. Not unusual for a place like this, but unfortunate. Maigret slipped the card into his pocket. Outside, the mist had thickened again, blurring the outlines of buildings across the street. Maigret stood under the awning, puffing on his pipe in silence. He wasn't thinking of crimes. Not yet, just of the boys' room. How untouched it felt, like a place paused mid-moment. He turned to Lucas. Go to Rue de Charenton. Start asking. About Delcroix. Don't press. Just listen. He left Monday. Someone must have seen something. And you? Lucas asked. Maigret looked up at the hotels for Wade once more. I'll stay nearby. There's something in the quiet of this place I haven't quite heard yet. He said nothing more. Maigret did not return to the office that afternoon. Instead, he took shelter in a small cafe across from the hotel. A narrow place called Le Zinc Bleu, with steamed-up windows and cracked tiles. Around the base of the counter, it wasn't the kind of cafe Maigret preferred, but it had a clear view of the hotel's entrance, and the waitress didn't bother him beyond asking once if he wanted another demi. He sipped slowly, pipe resting beside the glass. His hat still damp from the mist curling in under the door each time a patron came or went. The hours passed quietly, with no movement of note at the hotel. A middle-aged couple exited around 3:00, suitcases in hand, followed by a delivery boy with a parcel and no signature required. Once, a man walked up to the door checked the rooming list tacked beside the entrance, then turned away. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. But that was how things worked in these cases. The noise came later. First, the silence. Maigret's thoughts wandered, not to the case, but to his own youth. An image of a narrow street in St. Fiacre surfaced, unbidden. A boy he'd once known had disappeared one summer evening, only to be found days later hiding in the loft of a granary, hungry and terrified. Ashamed to admit he'd stolen a coin from his father. People didn't always vanish for dark reasons. Sometimes shame alone was enough. But Noel hadn't looked ashamed. He hadn't looked like he was hiding. He had simply vanished with all the neatness of someone who had meant to return by 5 o'clock. The drizzle turned to a light rain again. Maigret left the cafe and crossed to the hotel. Madame Bellou was still behind the desk, working on a pile of envelopes. She looked up, unsurprised, as he entered. "No news?" she asked, not hopefully. "Nothing urgent," Maigret replied. He stood for a moment, eyes drifting toward the wall behind her. It bore a framed photograph of the hotel from 2 decades earlier. Brighter then, freshly painted. A row of saplings where now only stubby tree trunks remained. Did the boy receive any letters? Letters, she frowned, only once or twice, from his mother, I believe. Postmarked Colma, recently, not in the last month. He wasn't much of a talker. Did he ever bring anyone back? A friend? A girl? Madame Bellou blinked, almost offended. "We're not that kind of hotel, Inspector." Maigret smiled gently. No offense meant. But boys his age often live secret lives, small ones, sometimes silly. They make meetings in doorways or leave notes behind clocks. Is there any place he used to go after work? "There's a cinema on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis," he mentioned. It once, and he liked the canal. Walked along it on his day off. Said it reminded him of home. Maigret thanked her and left again. The rain had lightened to a shimmer by then, and he decided to walk. The canal wasn't far, 10 minutes at his pace. It was the kind of grey evening that drew fewer people out. Just an old man feeding pigeons under his umbrella and a pair of boys loitering by the railings. Tossing pebbles, Maigret watched the water for a while, hands in his coat pockets. The air smelling faintly of iron and algae. Noel had come here to think, perhaps, or simply to be alone. A canal in Paris wasn't like a canal in the provinces. It didn't promise quiet. It promised a kind of neutral ground. He passed a bench under a leafless tree and paused there. A folded paper lay tucked between the slats. He bent slowly, knees protesting, and pulled it out. Not a clue, just a torn receipt from a nearby tobacconist. But even discarded scraps had something to say. Someone had sat here, smoked a cigarette, left a trace. He returned to the hotel after dark. The lobby was empty except for a pale man in a brown suit reading a newspaper. Maigret nodded at him politely and walked past. He asked Madame Bellou for the key to room 4. The one Delcroix had occupied. She hesitated. "I already turned it," she said. "There's a couple arriving tomorrow. I won't be long." She gave him the key. Upstairs, The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something floral, a cleaning agent, likely. The bedding had been changed. The ashtray was empty, but not scrubbed. Maigret sat in the chair beside the window and lit his pipe. The room was impersonal, neat, but something about it itched at him. He opened the small wardrobe. Nothing inside but to spare hangers. The drawers yielded nothing. No forgotten scarf. No stray button. But when he checked behind the nightstand, he found a matchbox wedged into the corner. Not hotel branded. It read Café de l'Avenir, Rue de Chabrol. It wasn't much, but it was something. He pocketed it. Back in the lobby, he handed Madame Bellou the key. Did Delcroix use the telephone? She shook her head. Not in the lobby. He may have had a portable set, though I never saw one. Did he speak to Noel? Not that I observed. But they crossed paths. He arrived Thursday. The boy worked the evening shift. They would have seen each other. Maigret nodded, then left. It was nearly 9 when he returned home. The smell of reheated stew greeted him as he hung his coat. Emily Maigret emerged from the kitchen in her apron. Her hair pinned up, glasses perched low on her nose. "You're late." "I stopped at the canal." She gave him a curious look, but didn't question it. They sat together, eating in silence. The stew was good, as always. Afterward, Maigret lit his pipe and moved to his chair. The evening paper lay untouched on the table, but he didn't reach for it. He stared at the window, watching shadows shift across the glass. Emily Maigret returned with a small pot of tea. She sat and folded her hands. "Something bothering you?" A boy disappeared, left everything behind. Maybe he went after a girl. Maigret looked at her. Maybe. They always leave for something or someone. They don't just vanish into the air. Maigret smiled faintly. They do, sometimes. She sipped her tea, not as someone was watching. He didn't reply, but he filed her words away. Later that night, in bed, he lay awake longer than usual. He thought of room 9, of the untouched socks, the dry towel, the razor still damp. He thought of room 4, of the matchbox in his coat pocket. And then, finally, of something Lucas had once said during a quiet night shift. "You can always feel it, Chief, when someone walks out of a room and they're not coming back. You can feel it in your bones." He drifted to sleep not long after, but his dreams were restless and full of unanswered footsteps. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky held that dull white sheen that promised it hadn't finished entirely. Maigret rose, early, unusually so, and by the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the cleaners were still scrubbing the floor outside the main staircase. He nodded at them, exchanged a brief word with Janvier in the corridor, something about a minor burglary in the 17th, and then made his way to his office. The matchbox from Café de l'Avenir lay on the desk where he'd left it the night before. He stared at it for a moment, then tucked it into his coat pocket and left again. The café was on Rue de Chabrol, a narrow street just beyond the station, lined with tired façades and low-traffic storefronts, a barber, a dusty bookshop, a brasserie that hadn't opened yet. Café de l'Avenir looked exactly like it sounded, modest, a little worn, but honest. A chalkboard outside advertised coffee, cognac, and plat du jour. Inside, the usual morning clientele occupied their usual places. A deliveryman with a crumpled racing form to pensioners playing belote, and a young woman with a scarf tied tightly under her chin, stirring coffee slowly. Maigret took a table near the counter, where he could see the door and the bar at once. He ordered a black coffee and took out a notebook. Though he didn't write in it, he let the scene settle. Observing cafes in the early morning was one of the city's better-kept secrets. You could learn more here than in the files upstairs. The man behind the bar was in his 50s, tall and thick-shouldered, with thinning hair and a prominent mole on his cheek. His apron was clean, his hands red from hot water. He moved like someone who had once been quick, but now took his time. After 10 minutes, Maigret rose and approached the bar. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's good, thanks." The barman wiped a glass. "You new around here?" "No, just passing through. I came because of this." He laid the matchbox gently on the bar. The barman looked at it, blinked, then shrugged. "We hand out dozens of those. Do you remember a man? Tall, mustache, thin face, dark coat. Might have come in last week. Called himself Delcroix." The barman frowned, tilting his head. "Delcroix? No, doesn't ring a bell. But I don't know everyone by name. He might have been with a younger man, 18 or so, blonde hair, spoke with an Alsatian accent. That caught something." The barman leaned back, slowly. "I did see a kid like that, Saturday evening, I think. He came in alone, sat over there by the back, looked nervous, ordered a lemonade and barely touched it. Did someone join him? I think so. I was in and out. Might have been that same fellow you described. They talked briefly. The man left first." "Did they argue?" "Not that I saw. But the boy didn't look happy. Stared at his drink for a while, then left without saying a word." Maigret left a coin on the bar and thanked him. Outside, the street had brightened slightly, though the sun still stayed hidden. He lit his pipe and walked without hurry, cutting back toward the station. The image lingered, a quiet boy sitting alone in a strange cafe, waiting for someone who left him more troubled than before. Back at the office, Lucas was waiting. "Nothing useful on Delcroix," he said, folding his arms. "Rudy Charenton's got no listing under that name. No one remembers anyone like him. Too common a name to trace through records. I even checked cafes and boarding houses. Blank slate." Maigret didn't seem surprised. "He may not be Delcroix at all." Lucas blinked. "Then why register under that name? To be found later, or to disappear easily?" Maigret opened his drawer and took out a street map. He circled the hotel, the cafe, and the canal. A small triangle, not much of a range. "Let's talk to the staff," he said. One of them might have seen more than they realized. They returned to the Hôtel Le Marignan after lunch. The sky had darkened again, and light rain flecked their coats as they stepped through the front doors. Madame Belleau looked up from her desk and gave a nod of recognition. "Is there trouble?" she asked. "Not yet," Maigret said. "We'd like to speak to your porter. The one on duty Saturday evening." "That would be Jules," she said. "He lives just down the corridor." She led them to a back hallway. Jules opened his door. Quickly, a short man in his 60s with a lazy eye and a limp, wearing a grey pullover and carpet slippers. "Sorry to disturb you," Maigret said gently. "We just want to clarify a few things." Jules invited them in without hesitation. His room was sparse: a hot plate, a radio, a bed with a heavy quilt. On the wall hung a photograph of a woman and two children, long faded. Jules sat slowly. "You work Saturday night, midnight to 8, as always. Did you see Noel? He came down around 9, helped some guests, then disappeared. I figured he was in his room. I didn't go up." "Did anyone unusual come in?" "Only that fellow in room 4. Thin chap, polite, paid in advance. I think Noel took his bag up when he arrived." "Did they speak afterward?" "Couldn't say. I don't hear everything. But Saturday night, I did see the boy go out briefly." Maigret's brow rose. "You're sure?" "Yes. He left through the side door around 10:30. No coat, just a scarf." "Did he return?" "I thought he did, around midnight, maybe a bit earlier. I heard the door creak. Didn't see him, but he had a quiet step." Maigret frowned. "Are you sure it was him?" Jules hesitated. "No. Now that you ask, I assumed. But I didn't see." That made Maigret pause. If Noel had left at 10:30 and hadn't returned, the door creaking at midnight could have been anyone, or no one at all. They thanked Jules and stepped out into the hall. Maigret didn't speak as they descended the stairs at the front desk. Madame Belleau was waiting, wringing her hands. "I remembered something," she said quickly, "about the man, Delcroix. When he left Monday morning, he asked for directions to a pawn shop." Maigret looked at her. "Did he say which one?" She shook her head. "Only that he needed to pawn something before catching a train. It was something, a sliver of movement." Maigret turned to Lucas. "Go to the pawn shops near Gare de l'Est. Show them his photo sketch. If we can pull one together, ask if anything was pawned Monday morning. Watches, rings, anything traceable. And you?" Lucas asked again. Maigret lit his pipe slowly. "I'll speak to the other staff, the chambermaids. Sometimes they notice the smallest things." He said it with a quiet certainty, the kind that came from long years of listening to the wrong details. Until the right one slipped through. The story hadn't broken open yet, but it had begun to loosen. Somewhere in the folds of this quiet hotel, between the nervous boy and the polite stranger, was a truth wrapped in silence, and Maigret, as always, would wait it out. The chambermaids were not difficult to find. They worked in shifts, mostly part-time and rotated by floor. The one assigned to room 9 that week was a girl named Lenny, not more than 20, with freckles, clipped hair, and the kind of quick eyes that missed very little. She met Maigret in the small side lounge on the ground floor, where the linen trolley was kept, and folded her arms tight against her chest as she answered. "I liked Noel," she said plainly. "He wasn't like the others. He never stared, never joked too much, just did his work. Maigret watched her, not pressing. He'd say hello, carry my basket if it was heavy. That kind of boy. Didn't smoke, except sometimes when he was anxious. I saw him on Saturday afternoon in the hallway. He looked distracted. Did he say anything? She hesitated. He asked if I thought people could disappear without being missed. What did you say? I laughed. I thought he was joking. Said if someone vanished from this place, Madame Bellou would notice before the door closed behind them. Maigret smiled faintly. Did he ask about any guests? Not directly, but he pointed toward room 4. Asked if the man there had been staying long. I said 3 nights. He nodded. That was it. So he noticed Delcroix. She nodded. They didn't speak in front of me. But once I passed them in the stairwell, Noel had just come up from the courtyard. The other man had a cigarette in his mouth. They paused, not talking, but something passed between them. Like what? She shook her head. I'm not sure. Not anger, not familiarity either. But the boy seemed smaller afterward. Not scared, just a smaller. That word stuck with Maigret. He thanked her, then took a walk around the neighborhood. Not to chase leads, just to think. The streets were busy with afternoon errands, students on bicycles, dogs pulling their owners past newspaper kiosks. The rain had not returned, but the air held its moisture. Maigret moved without purpose, letting the noise of Paris pass over him. Something about the case was beginning to bother him, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. Noel had no secrets in his room. He had no enemies, no entanglements. But he had looked troubled on Saturday. That single cigarette, the remark to Lenny, and Delcroix, or whoever he was, had vanished with equal silence. What connected them? Back at headquarters, Lucas returned around for, damp from the collar and annoyed. To pawn shops confirmed it, he said, dropping his coat. A man matching the description came in Monday morning. One of them remembered him well, said he pawned a gold wristwatch and a silver cigarette case. No engraving, no paperwork required. Did he give a name? None that checked out. Just signed Rene D. The cigarette case had initials. N.K. Maigret's brow furrowed. Noel Kimmer. Could be. Maigret stood, his pipe, long since cooled, and moved to the window. So he had Noel's belongings. That changes things. Lucas nodded, but no report of theft. And if he stole them, he did it quietly. To quietly, Maigret said. He paced slowly. Let's suppose this. The boy meets Delcroix at the cafe. Something passes between them. He returns to the hotel. Then he disappears. Delcroix leaves. With his watch and cigarette case. No struggle, no alarm, and no body. Lucas asked the obvious question. So was it blackmail, a debt, or did the boy leave on his own? Maigret didn't answer. He was looking at the map again. Hattel-la-Marignan, the cafe, the pawn shop, and then the canal. He pointed. I want a diver at the St. Martin Lock tomorrow morning. Lucas frowned. You think? I don't think anything. But if he was going to disappear without bags, without a note, and never return, it would have had to be fast, clean, and nearby. Lucas left to make arrangements. That evening, Maigret returned to the hotel one last time, not to question, just to sit. He took the same chair in the small lounge near the linen trolley. The light was low, the walls still faintly smelling of polish and dust. He listened to the groan of the pipes, the shuffle of footsteps, the muted clink of a spoon in a distant teacup. These hotels held everything quietly: voices, secrets, disappearances. The walls never said much, but they always knew. He rose slowly and made one final stop. Room 9. It had been turned down again, ready for the next occupant. The socks were gone, the bed sheets tight, the razor cleaned. Maigret moved through the room gently, as if not wanting to disturb what still lingered. He crouched beside the table, not to look, but to feel. There was a piece of tape on the underside, a small square. He peeled it away carefully, revealing a slip of folded paper. It was a receipt from Café de l'Avenir, dated the previous Thursday. 1 lemonade, 1 espresso, written in pencil on the back, barely legible. Don't tell them about Strasbourg. He read it twice, then tucked it back under the tape and left it there, back at home. Mme Maigret was reading when he returned. Still raining. She asked, "Not yet. You've been gone long." "There's a boy no one sees," he replied simply. But someone knows why. She didn't press. They had lived through too many cases for her to need the whole story. Over dinner, Maigret thought about Strasbourg. Noel had come from Alsace. Was someone looking for him there? Was someone chasing or hiding? Later that night, as he sat with his pipe in hand, he scribbled for names on a scrap of paper. Noel Kimmer, Delcroix, Strasbourg. Cigarette case, NK. He circled the second. He wasn't ready to accuse, but he was ready to wait. The next morning brought a fog that settled thick over the streets, clinging to coats and windows like smoke that refused to lift. Maigret stood near the St. Martin lock just after 8. The collar of his coat turned up, watching as the divers from the River Brigade prepared their equipment. The canal, murky and still, gave no suggestion of secrets. Its surface rippled only when the first diver slid in with a dull splash, disappearing quickly beneath. Lucas stood beside Maigret with a thermos of coffee and a face drawn from lack of sleep. "No sign of Delcroix," he said. "I've got 2 men checking rail departures from Gare de l'Est on Monday morning. Still no identification, still no prints on file. He's a ghost." Maigret nodded, but said nothing. He lit his pipe, not because he needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. The longer the divers stayed under, the more it weighed on him. He wasn't hoping for a body, but he wasn't hoping for nothing either. After half an hour, one of the divers resurfaced and called to the sergeant on shore. A few minutes later, a small box was brought up, wooden, with peeling paint and rusted hinges. Not large enough for anything conclusive. It was opened and found to contain only broken glass and a sodden length of cloth. No body. No wallet. No suitcase. No shoes. Maigret didn't react. He simply turned back toward the street and began walking. Lucas caught up with him a few steps later. "Where to now?" "Strasbourg," Maigret said. Lucas blinked. You're going? I'm sending a wire first. To the local station. Ask about Noel Kimmer. Parents. Any recent reports of concern. Ask if anyone named Delcroix has come through town recently. Or René D. Lucas scribbled the names in his notebook as they walked. You think the boy ran from something back there? I think the story didn't start here. Maigret replied. Back at headquarters, the wire was sent within the hour. By noon, a reply came from the Strasbourg police. Noel Kimmer's family lived in a village outside the city. Father, retired railway worker. Mother, homemaker. No reports filed. The boy had written home regularly until 2 weeks ago. Then silence. They hadn't said anything, assuming he was busy with work. As for Delcroix, no one by that name matched the description. But a René Dubois, 34, known for petty theft and fraud, had recently been seen traveling through the area. Last known whereabouts, Paris, 4 days ago. Maigret leaned back in his chair. Dubois, not Delcroix. He walked the name to the records department himself. After half an hour, they returned with a thin file, a photograph clipped to the front. High cheekbones, trimmed mustache, narrow shoulders. The face matched the one described by Madame Belleau and the pawnshop attendant. Petty swindler. Lucas muttered, reading over his shoulder. Forgery, impersonation, bounced checks. Mostly small jobs. Bit of a drifter, which makes him more dangerous in a place like that hotel, Maigret said. People like Dubois slip through doors because they don't look threatening. They're polite, quiet, temporary. He stared at the photograph a moment longer, then stood. Get me a car. Where to? Outskirts of the city. Let's visit the people Noel didn't call. The village of Nordheim sat about 20 kilometers west of Strasbourg. Small enough that directions consisted of the baker, the schoolhouse, and the place with the dog that always barks. They arrived just before sunset, the sky beginning to bruise at the edges. The Kimmer home was modest, a one-story cottage with a low fence and flower pots beneath the windows. A thin stream of chimney smoke rose lazily above. Maigret knocked twice. It was the mother who answered, a slight woman with grey hair in a thick braid, an apron over her dress. She did not seem alarmed at the sight of 2 strangers, only mildly curious. Maigret introduced himself and asked to speak with her and her husband. She led them inside without comment. The father sat in a chair by the stove, a newspaper folded across his knee, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He stood when Maigret entered and extended a hand. Noel, Maigret said gently, is not in trouble. But we need to understand something. Did he ever speak of someone named René Dubois? Or Delcroix? The father looked confused. The mother hesitated. I think he mentioned a man. She said slowly, but only in passing. He wrote that someone at the hotel had offered him an opportunity. What kind? He didn't say. Only that he was thinking about it. Was he ever in trouble before? The father shook his head firmly. Never. A quiet boy. Worked hard. Wanted to make us proud. He didn't drink. Didn't steal. He sent money home every month. Did he have any reason to be afraid of anyone? Afraid? The mother blinked. No. But Maigret leaned forward slightly. But she fidgeted with her apron. He mentioned someone had asked him to carry something. A parcel. From Paris to Strasbourg. He didn't do it. Said it felt wrong. Did he say what was in it? No. Maigret and Lucas exchanged a glance. May I see his letters? The mother went to a drawer and returned with a bundle of envelopes, tied with string. Maigret flipped through them. Neat handwriting, short messages, mentions of work, weather, money. Nothing alarming until the last one, 2 weeks ago. Things here are fine, but I may have a decision to make. Don't worry, I'll do what's right. If anyone comes asking questions, don't say anything about last spring. I'll explain it all soon. Maigret folded the letter carefully. What happened last spring? The parents looked at each other, hesitant. There was an incident, the father said at last. A man came to town, claimed to be a recruiter for seasonal hotel work. He gathered 5 boys, Noel included, promised them work in Paris. They left together. 3 came back within a week, said it was all a lie. Noel stayed. Did he ever say what happened? No, only that he'd found a real job afterward. Maigret stood slowly, thanked them, and stepped out into the fading light. The village was quiet. Smoke drifted from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Back in the car, Lucas finally spoke. You think Dubois was the recruiter? Maybe, or he worked with one. But I think Noel knew who he was, and whatever happened. Back then, whatever last spring meant, it caught up with him, Lucas asked. So what do we do now? Maigret stared out the window as the car rolled down the narrow road. Now we wait, he said. Dubois made a mistake. He pawned something that wasn't his. We have his name. Eventually, someone will see him, and when they do, we'll be there. He didn't say the rest, that he feared Noel might already be beyond reach. That silence often buried the guilty and the innocent in the same breath. But the hunt had changed, and so had Maigret's understanding of the boy who had vanished without leaving. 3 days passed, and Paris resumed its quiet hum of routine. The city, in its usual rhythm, did not concern itself with missing bellboys or the movement of petty criminals. Maigret spent much of that time in his office or walking the streets. Near the Hôtel Marignan, stopping for coffee, reading the same headlines. Occasionally watching trains roll out of Gare de l'Est with the distant thought that one might carry Dubois further away with each passing hour. But he wasn't gone. Not yet. On the 4th morning, just before noon, Lucas entered the office without knocking. Brunette from the 7th just rang. A man matching Dubois's description was spotted at a small hotel off Rue Clerc last night. Checked in under the name René Dannett. Left this morning around 8. Didn't return his key. Didn't pay. Maigret stood, reached for his coat. Let's go. They arrived at the Hotel Saint-Michel 20 minutes later. The front clerk, a stooped man with 2 large spectacles, confirmed the guest had used a false name. Paid for 1 night, cash, no bags, said he'd be back after breakfast, never returned. What room? 6, the man said. 2nd floor. They climbed the stairs and opened the door. The room smelled of stale smoke and soap. On the table was a newspaper folded neatly to the classifieds. In the waste bin, Maigret found a torn envelope. No letter inside, just the envelope, addressed to a box at a post office near Pigalle. The name written on it was Jean be another name. Lucas muttered. Maigret nodded. They always change their names, but they forget the habits. They checked with the post office that afternoon. The box belonged to an agency that held mail for transients, often men who had no fixed address or who didn't want one. They couldn't say who Jean B. was, but a woman in the back office remembered a man picking up mail the day before. Thin, mustache, polite, no hat. He had a letter in his hand when he left, she added. Didn't look happy about it. Maigret stared at her for a long moment. Could you recognize him again? She nodded slowly. If I had to. Good. Stay close. Someone may come back for another letter. Maigret didn't go back to the quay. He returned to Rue d'Alsace, to the Marignan. He wanted to look again, not for evidence, for tone, for atmosphere. The desk clerk, a younger woman this time, greeted him with surprise, but no protest. Room 4, he asked. Is it occupied? No, monsieur. It's free. We've had cancellations this week. He walked up slowly, pipe unlit, footsteps heavy on the threadbare carpet. Inside, the room was just as it had been. Maigret stood in the middle of it, listening. It was a room made for disappearing. Nothing distinct. No photograph on the wall. No scent of perfume or food. You could vanish from a place like this, and the room would never tell. He sat on the edge of the bed and closed his eyes. What had Dubois seen in Noel? A quiet boy. No enemies. No trouble. But perhaps a secret. Or simply a vulnerability. Noel had been afraid of something from Strasbourg or someone. And Dubois, who thrived on manipulation, might have seen it, might have said, I can make it go away, but it'll cost you. And Noel, who had no one in Paris, might have agreed. Maigret opened his eyes. What if it had gone wrong? Back downstairs. Madame Belleau returned from the shops and found him waiting in the lobby. She set her basket down carefully. Any news? She asked. Nothing final. He paused. Did you ever see Dubois with anything unusual? A parcel? A bag that wasn't his? She shook her head. He came with one suitcase. Worn. Leather. I assumed it was his. Did Noel ever handle it? Of course. He carried it upstairs when the man arrived. Did the guest ever leave it unattended? She thought for a moment. I believe so. On Friday, he went out for an hour, left the case in the room. Maigret's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He left without another word. That evening, just after dark, a call came in from the Pigalle post office. The woman had returned to her desk, and Dubois, or someone like him, had entered, looked around, and left quickly. No mail collected. Maigret was there within minutes. The neighborhood bustled with music, flashing lights, and the shifting crowd of evening drinkers. But in that post office, everything was still. The clerk confirmed it. Same man, same face. He saw someone behind him and walked out. Maigret. walked the block himself, slowly, methodically, his hat low and pipe between his teeth. He saw no one matching the description, but that wasn't surprising. A man like Dubois knew when to vanish. It was his skill. Back at the station, Maigret sat for a long time in his office, on his desk. The matchbox, the pawn receipt, the photo from the records, and the scrap of paper from the boys' room. Don't tell them about Strasbourg. There was no proof, nothing to charge, nothing to confront. But the story had nearly finished itself. Noel, young and unsure, had crossed paths with Dubois in the spring, whether by deception or coincidence. They had met again in Paris. Dubois had likely offered him something, money, protection, silence, or threatened him. In return, Noel may have handed over his valuables, or worse, been forced into something, and then vanished. Maigret stood and walked to the window. In most cases, a crime leaves behind evidence. In this one, it left behind a mood, a shadow that wouldn't lift. The boy was gone. The man was on the run. But beneath the surface, something had happened, a transaction, a betrayal, a disappearance quiet enough that even the walls had nothing to say. Later that night, Emily Maigret found her husband still awake. "You're tired," she said gently. "I'm used to tired." "Did you find him?" "No. Will you?" Maigret looked up. "I don't think he wants to be found." She set a cup of tea on the table and sat beside him. "Sometimes that's the answer." And he nodded. Because in a city full of voices, the loudest story was sometimes told by silence. 2 mornings later, the fog returned, draping itself over Paris like a shawl too heavy to remove. The Seine moves slowly beneath its weight, the bridges turning ghost-like in the distance. Maigret walked alone, not toward any place in particular, but drawn, perhaps, by a need to feel the texture of the city underfoot. His coat collar was pulled tight, pipe unlit in his hand, the streets whispering around him with the quiet clink of shutters and the drip of yesterday's rain from metal gutters. Noel had not returned. No new sightings of Dubois, no further movement at the post office. Officially, the case was at a standstill. No crime had been reported. No body had been found. No formal charges could be filed. And yet, Maigret felt the case breathing, faint, quiet, but still there, like a weak pulse hiding beneath the collar of an otherwise healthy man. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier had left a note. A call had come in late from a woman living on the edge of the 18th arrondissement, not far from Montmartre. She worked as a caretaker in a small residential building. Said a man who might be Dubois had tried to rent a room under the name Bertrand, left a false number, paid nothing. Maigret went alone. The building was quiet, 5 stories high. The plaster yellowed with age. On the ground floor, behind a narrow desk, sat the caretaker, a large woman in her 50s with a cigarette hanging loosely from her lips. Her eyes narrowed as Maigret approached, but she didn't stand. "You're the police." "I am." She tapped ash into an overfilled tray. "He came 2 nights ago. Said he'd pay in the morning. Never did. I didn't like the look of him." "Did he say where he was going?" "No. But He asked too many questions. Wanted to know about the other tenants. Wanted to know if I ever checked rooms without notice. Maigret's brow lifted. Did you? Not usually. But I did the next morning. The room was empty. Only thing he left was this. She reached into a drawer and slid a small folded note across the table. Maigret opened it. A single name was written in blue ink, slanted to the right. Noel Kimmer. Did he say anything else? No, just smiled too much. Maigret nodded, slipping the note into his coat pocket. He climbed the stairs to the vacant room, though he knew there would be nothing inside. Still, he opened the windows, let the fog drift in, and listened. The silence pressed against the walls. From there, he went to the café, Café de l'Avenir. The same barman stood behind the counter, now, reading a racing sheet. He looked up as Maigret entered, recognizing him at once. Still looking for your man? Yes. The barman set down the paper. He came back. Maigret paused. When? Late last night. Had a drink. Sat at the back. Didn't speak. Didn't stay long. But I'd bet a week's wages it was the same fellow. Did he leave? Anything? No. But he looked worn. Not frightened. Just finished. Maigret nodded slowly. Was he alone? The barman hesitated. He wasn't when he came in. There was a woman with him. Early 40s. Blonde hair. Fur collar. She sat 2 tables away but left first. He followed her out 5 minutes later. Maigret left a few coins and stepped back outside. The street hadn't changed, nor had the air. But something in the case was turning. Dubois, or whatever his real name was, wasn't running anymore. He was circling. Back at the office, he laid out the entire story on paper, not as a report, but as a reconstruction, a portrait in words. A boy leaves home. He is quiet, obedient. Unknown in Paris, he meets a man, perhaps months earlier, perhaps only days. This man offers something, a promise, a threat, a manipulation. The boy becomes nervous, asks questions, begins to regret, then silence. The man, Dubois, floats through Paris like a discarded leaflet, changing names, addresses, moods. He pawns the boy's belongings. He visits cafes. He probes for rooms. He leaves behind fragments, a matchbox. Upon receipt, a false address, a note with a name. And in the center of it, still, is a boy no one can find. The next day, just after lunch, a call came from a nurse at the Hospital St. Louis. A man had been admitted with a fractured wrist and signs of exhaustion. No documents. Claimed to be Jean Bertrand, but his face matched the photo distributed days earlier. The nurse had seen the bulletin. She thought the man wanted to be found. Maigret arrived within the hour. The ward was quiet, with the pale hush of disinfectant and distant footfalls. The man lay in bed near the far window, wrist bandaged, eyes half closed. His cheek bore a fresh bruise. Maigret stood at the foot of the bed, not speaking. The man opened his eyes. Recognition flickered. He smiled, tired, crooked. You've been looking for me? Yes. I wondered how long it would take. Maigret pulled a chair close and sat, hands resting on his knees. What happened to Noel Kimmer? Dubois or Bertrand or Delcroix looked away. I didn't kill him. I didn't say you did. He left Saturday night, said he. Couldn't go through with it. Took nothing. Just walked out. Through the side door. Yes. Maigret waited. He was supposed to take something to Strasbourg. A case. No questions. But he backed out. Said he felt watched. That someone in the hotel knew. I told him he was being foolish. And then he left. I waited. I took his things. I thought he might come back. He didn't. Maigret studied him carefully. Why use his name later? The man closed his eyes, because I had no other, and because part of me thought he wouldn't need it again. Maigret sat in silence for a long while. There's no proof, he said quietly. I know. No body. No witness. Just traces. I know. The man said again. The nurse returned shortly after, signaling the end of the visit. Maigret stood. You'll be held, he said, not for murder, but for fraud, for theft, of course. And if we find the boy, the man opened his eyes again. If you find him, I'll be grateful. Maigret left the hospital and walked out into the slow drizzle now falling once again over the city. He passed a newspaper stand, glanced at the headlines, ignored them. The canal had no body. The streets had no footprints. The boy had no farewell. But something remained. A quiet ache in the spaces Noel had touched. The neatly folded socks. The careful notes to his mother. The empty coffee glass in the cafe. It was not enough to charge a man, but it was enough to mourn. That night, Maigret returned home with the slow weight of unfinished things resting across his shoulders. The rain had returned in earnest, tapping softly on the windows of the flat as Enemy Maigret set down his dinner. Reheated cabbage and sausage, warm bread, and tea he would forget. To drink. She didn't ask him about the case. She never did when his face held that look. Instead, she told him about a broken faucet in the building and how Madame Besson, on the third floor, had accused the new tenant of stealing her milk bottles. He nodded. Listening but not listening. After supper, he sat in his chair, pipe in hand. The smell of damp wool rising from his sleeves. The file sat open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. He had read it a dozen times already. Noel Kimmer, born 1937, Nordheim, Alsace, father, retired SNCF worker, mother, homemaker, arrived in Paris, April of this year. No criminal record. Worked at Hettel Le Marignan from May onward. Disappeared on the night of October 25th. There was still no official crime. The boy had left no body, no confession, no plea. All they had were impressions, a nervous glance, a missed letter, a stranger with too many names. And yet Maigret could not let it go. Not because he needed to solve it, but because he needed to understand it. Noel had walked out of the hotel, through the side door wearing only a scarf. It had been raining. He had not taken his coat, his watch, or his razor, and no one had seen him since. He might have drowned. He might have run. He might have simply faded. But Maigret had seen boys like him before. Boys who walked too quietly, who carried burdens no one asked about, who vanished without leaving anger or guilt behind. Just a space that used to be full. He rose, tucked the file under his arm, and stepped out. Enemy Maigret didn't try to stop him. She only asked if he'd be back for breakfast. He walked to Rue d'Alsace once more, the hotel's sign flickering gently in the mist. Madame Bellou had gone home for the night. But the night porter, Jules, was awake, sipping tea behind the desk with an old scarf wrapped twice around his neck. Maigret nodded and stepped past him without explanation. He climbed the stairs slowly. Room 9 was empty again. The last guest had left that morning. The door creaked as he opened it. Inside, everything was as it had been. The narrow bed, the chair angled slightly toward the window, the small washstand. But now it felt less like a room and more like a preserved thought, as if the moment Noel had left, everything had frozen around him, waiting for someone to return. Maigret sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't light his pipe. He only looked. After 10 minutes, he opened the wardrobe. The extra blanket was folded neatly on the top shelf. The hangers rattled slightly as he moved them. He crouched again, checked under the bed, and this time he found something tucked deep in the corner behind one of the support slats. Was a small canvas pouch, frayed at the edges, stained slightly with what looked like tea or ink. He pulled it out gently. Inside were papers, folded tightly, fragile from the damp. A photograph fell out first. Noel, younger, standing beside 2 other boys, and a man with his hand on Noel's shoulder. The man looked familiar. Maigret stared at it for a long time. Then he unfolded the papers. They were letters, unsent, not addressed, just written. The first read, "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, it would go away. But it hasn't. He came back, and now I owe him something. I didn't ask for it. I didn't agree. But last spring, when the others left, I didn't. I stayed. And that means he owns me." That's how he talks, like I'm something he can collect. The second letter was even shorter. "If I don't come back, tell my mother I meant to." I thought I could outwait him. But some people don't go away. They just wait longer than you. Maigret folded them again, slowly, and returned them to the pouch. It was enough. Not enough for an arrest. There was no crime described in the letters, but enough to know that Noel hadn't run away to begin again. He'd run to escape something that already had its hands on him. And he had chosen, perhaps in the last clear moment he had, to disappear rather than submit. Back at the precinct the next morning, Maigret sat with Lucas and Janvier and laid the pouch on the desk. He read the letters aloud. No one interrupted. Lucas asked, "So what now?" "Now we wait," Maigret said. "Dubois is still in custody. We charge him with fraud, with possession of stolen property. Let the judge decide if more comes of it." "And Noel?" "If he's alive," Maigret said slowly, "he'll surface when he's ready. If he's not, we may never know." Janvier frowned. "That's it. No, that's Paris. Some disappearances aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be witnessed." He stood, walked to the window. The city moved below him, endless, wet, unaware. Later that day, he visited the hospital one last time. Dubois was sitting up now, flipping through an old magazine, his wrist still in a brace. Maigret didn't sit. "I found the letters," he said simply. Dubois blinked. "I didn't touch him." "I know. He left." "Yes. So why are you here?" Maigret paused. "Because I wanted to see if you'd say his name." Dubois looked away. Maigret turned and left. That evening, as he sat with Mme. Maigret, and the radio played a slow waltz in the background, he sipped his wine and said nothing for a long time. She waited. Then, softly, she asked, "Did the boy write home?" "No." "Then you'll tell them?" "Yes." "And what will you say?" Maigret looked at her. "That he was good, that he tried to be brave, that he carried something alone until he couldn't any more." She nodded and reached across the table, resting her hand over his. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The streets shimmered under the street lamps, and somewhere, far away, a bell rang for a mass that few would attend. And in a room on the top floor of a quiet hotel, a canvas pouch sat now in an evidence drawer, filled not with facts, but with the quiet truth of a boy who had once tried to disappear properly. In the days that followed, life in Paris resumed its usual rhythm. The leaves fell heavier on the sidewalks near the Quai des Orfèvres. Trams clattered. Rain threatened but rarely came, and inside the precinct, new cases were posted to the board. Robberies in the 9th, a suspicious fire in Montreux, a missing businessman whose mistress had suddenly returned to Bordeaux. But for Maigret, the silence around Noel Kimmer's disappearance remained loud. He kept the pouch of letters locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, not as evidence. He knew they would never be used in court, but as memory. Sometimes that was all a case left behind. Not a verdict, not a criminal, just his shape in the mind. Like the outline of a picture that had been removed from a wall. Lucas stopped by late one evening, coat unbuttoned, hair damp from the fog. "I saw the hotel again today," he said. "What passed it by accident?" Maigret looked up, and nothing's changed. Same concierge, same lamp flickering outside. Room 9's occupied again. That's how it goes. Lucas hesitated. "Do you think he's dead by?" "Don't know," Maigret said, "but I don't think he wanted to die. That's different." Lucas nodded slowly, then turned to go, but paused at the door. "You ever think about where people go when they vanish? All the time. And they go where no one asks who they are." A week later, Maigret took the train to Strasbourg. He hadn't planned to. No official reason had been filed, but something in him needed to close the loop, or at least feel where it had started. The journey was quiet, rain on the windows, a small bottle of brandy in his pocket. The train rolled through flat, grey countryside that shifted slowly into the neat geometry of the Alsatian fields. He arrived in the village near Nordheim just after noon. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet hay. A boy passed on a bicycle, scarf flapping behind him. Maigret walked the narrow lanes until he reached the Kimmer house. Pausing at the gate, Madame Kimmer opened the door even before he knocked. She looked tired but unsurprised. "You came." "I said I would." She led him inside without fuss. The stove was warm. A pot of soup bubbled gently. The father stood slowly from his chair and shook Maigret's hand. "Have you found him?" "No," Maigret said honestly, "but I wanted to give you this." He set the letters on the table. The pouch. The photo. The mother opened it slowly, reverently, as if it might still contain a piece of her son. She read in silence. Her hands didn't tremble. "He wrote these?" The father asked. Double quotes. "Yes. He never posted them. And this man, the one who—" "Dubois," Maigret said. "We have him in custody. Not for your son's disappearance, but enough to keep him a while." The father turned toward the window, jaw clenched. "Did he hurt him?" "I don't think so. I think Noel ran before that could happen." The mother looked up. "Will he be punished?" Maigret was quiet for a moment. "Not for what he did to your son. The law doesn't work on things left unsaid." She nodded. "Then we'll light a candle for Noel, and another for the boy he was before he met that man, before he left." The mother handed him something wrapped in a cloth. "He left it behind the last time he visited." It was a book. Comtesse Alsatian's. Well read, pages annotated in pencil. A child's drawing tucked between two chapters. A little boy with a round face. A suitcase in one hand, and a star above his head. Maigret thanked them and walked back to the station. He didn't look back. Back in Paris, November thickened around the buildings. The fog returned and stayed for days, muting the city in grey and gold. Maigret resumed his work. To burglaries in Belleville, an assault case in the 13th. But he kept the book on his shelf and the letters in his drawer. One morning, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a scarf, wool, blue-grey, folded neatly. No note, no explanation. Maigret held it for a long time before placing it in the drawer beside the letters. He said nothing about it. Weeks later, the first real cold set in. Snow began to threaten. In the cafe near the canal, the barman told Lucas he'd seen someone who looked like Noel, or maybe just someone who looked like a boy I wanted to see again. The canals remained empty. A Hettle la Marignan. Madame Belleau took on a new bellboy, 17, shy, eyes a little too wide. She gave him room 9 without thinking. It had been cleaned, painted, changed. Life rolled on. In his office one evening, Maigret sat looking out over the river. The lamplight behind him glowed warm and orange. The rain streaked the window. He watched a man walk across Pont Louis Philippe, shoulders hunched against the wind, a suitcase in his hand. He thought of Noel, wherever he had gone, whether hiding, wandering, or simply living under a new name. Maigret hoped he had found silence on his own terms, not one imposed by fear. Some cases end in arrests, some in confessions, but others, the quiet ones, end with a boy walking out into the rain without his coat. Knowing it was the only way to survive, Maigret picked up the scarf from the drawer, held it a moment, then folded it again and placed it gently back. Then he turned out the light, and the city went on. It was late December when the final envelope arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres. It bore no return address, just Maigret's name in small, careful handwriting. The postmark read Bottle, smudged but legible. Lucas handed it to him in the hallway without comment, though his eyes lingered curiously as Maigret slipped it into his coat pocket and continued down the corridor toward his office. He waited until the door was closed before opening it. Inside were two items, a photograph and a letter. The photograph was of a quiet street, cobbled, clean, lined with bare trees. A small pension in the background bore a wooden sign with the name Gasthaus Somme. In the foreground, seated on a bench, a young man in a dark coat and scarf looked directly into the lens. He wasn't smiling, but his face wasn't troubled. His hands rested on his knees. Older now, thinner, but unmistakable. Noel. Maigret turned the photo over. A short message was written in the same careful hand. "I'm working. I sleep well. I am safe. Please don't tell them where I am. Just tell them I'm still trying to be who they hoped I'd become." The letter, folded behind the photo, contained more. "I left because I couldn't breathe. You probably already know that. I thought I could outweigh Dubois, but it wasn't about him in the end. It was about me, about shame, about being looked at like something that broke. He told me I owed him. From last spring. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. I'll never know. But I couldn't give him more. I thought about running to the police. I passed the precinct twice. I even wrote a letter to my mother, but didn't send it. In the end, I walked. The canal was there, the city behind me. The coat stayed on the hook. You looked for me. I didn't expect that. Thank you. I'm not dead. I'm just elsewhere." Maigret read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the same drawer where the scarf and the unsent letters rested. He didn't show it to Lucas. He didn't log it officially. Some truths weren't meant for the record. Later that evening, he sat at the corner cafe not far from the hotel, Le Zinc Blue, where steam rose from his coffee, and the windows blurred with condensation. A child outside pressed his hands against the glass, laughing. The boy's father called to him, and they vanished into the streetlight. Across from him, Lucas joined quietly, dropping a file onto the table. "That assault in the 13th looks like it's going nowhere." Maigret nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Then Lucas asked, "Do you think he'll come back?" "No," Maigret said. "But that's not the point. What is that he left a trace." Lucas sipped his coffee. "Sometimes I wonder how you do it, how you let cases like this go." Maigret smiled faintly, eyes distant. "I don't let them go. I carry them, quietly." Outside, the rain began again, soft, constant, washing the streets clean in its usual way. And somewhere in Basel, a boy who had once vanished into the Paris fog now swept the floor of a quiet guest house, folded linens in silence, and watched snow gather on the windowsill, unremarked but not forgotten.